kind of otherworldly of like what you can already do with prototype nanobots. And, obviously, if we want to do anything in cryonics on the long run, we need a very advanced nanotechnology. So I think that, nanotech, the whole molecular machines tech tree, I see that as a very big enabling technology tree for the longevity tree.
Hey guys, Alex here, and welcome to another new episode of the DeSci Podcast. We have a fantastic guest in Allison Duettmann today. She's the president of the Foresight Institute, a nonprofit working to advance biotech, nanotech, and computing for the long-term benefit of life. She shares Foresight's work with the public in the Wall Street Journal, South by Southwest, O'Reilly AI, WEF, the Partnership on AI, Effective Altruism Global, and TEDx. She founded existentialhope.com, co-edited the book Superintelligence, Coordination and Strategy with Roman Yampolsky, and is currently working on a book on intelligent cooperation. She holds a master's in philosophy and public policy from the London School of Economics, focusing on AI safety, and a bachelor's in philosophy, politics, and economics from York University. Today we spoke about the importance of optimism, Foresight's work on everything from decentralized computing to health extension, as well as tech trees and the value of decentralized science. Hope you enjoy. All right, Allison. Before we get into the bulk of things, I'd like to ask a bit about your path that led you to speaking with me today. What was this process early on of discovering futurism? What got you excited about it, and how did that shape your path to ultimately finding yourself at Foresight?
Well, I guess there's multiple different answers to this. A few are more professional than others. But really, since I remember, I grew up in Germany, and that's where I'm from, but I always found the notion of death pretty difficult. And just because life is really quite fantastic at its best, like it definitely has its challenges. I don't want to diminish those, but I think on a good day, many of us can agree that life is really pretty wonderful. And I think that an 80-year time life is just a little bit arbitrary. And then, I think that as a child, it's really easy to ask these questions because, you don't really have the societal kind of like artificial boundaries around how a life should go yet, very ingrained in you. And then obviously the more you ask, the more often you get told that this is just the way it is, and so forth. And so over time you just kind of like learn to accept it. But it was definitely this kind of like longing for more was often like a pretty big part of my life. And then over time, I think, I first like dabbled a bit in philosophy around this because I wanted to see if anyone else was really thinking around these same lines as well. Because in Germany, there weren't that many, at least at the time. I know this changed also a lot with people taking more of an interest in the future. So I was very interested, became through that like longing for a longer, more flourishing, kind of like expansionary life, became very interested in two things. One are technologies, because we really need them if we want to get anywhere. But then also the other one is existential risk on the other side, just because I think as a child you think that all you have to do is just for yourself to survive. But then the older you get, sometimes you realize that there are no adults in the room. And, if we don't play our cards right, we may not have any civilization that survives at all in the very long-term future. And so I think that, one thing that if you're interested in your own long-term survival is you are immediately interested in survival and the survival of civilization as well, at least the moment that you realize that it's not a given. And, obviously technologies are on the one way a path for us to reach better worlds, and on the other end also a potential addition to existential risks. And so, it's a long-winded way of saying I got interested in technologies through like a wish for a longer, happier life for myself and for civilization. And then I found Foresight on the internet. I cold emailed them from my university and convinced them to take me on.
Wow. That's an incredible story. And, you alluded to this a little bit, but it goes into another question I have at a more foundational level, which is about positive visions of the future. You mentioned this great quote about raising reality to meet your expectations rather than lowering expectations to meet reality. So my question for you is, why are positive visions of the future for humanity so important?
Well, I mean, it always depends on who you talk to. I'm assuming that most people listening to this wonderful podcast already have taken, I guess, what's more in the crypto circle called the green pill. um, uh, but um, but I think that's, it's not like that everywhere. Like I think usually when you look around, and maybe even more so in Europe, or at least pockets in Europe than in pockets of Silicon Valley, I think you find that despite the fact that life has been improving pretty steadily over the last hundreds, if not thousands of years, you know, our kind of like realization that it has not been steadily adjusting. So I think that, if most of the time, if you ask around, people think that, things are getting worse, that, violence is increasing, that, pretty substantial like societal flaws are increasing. And so I think it doesn't often match with the actual kind of like improvement in living conditions that many of us were fortunate enough to receive over the past, like really few hundred thousand years. And so I think, this kind of like realization of like, positive, like a positive outlook, I think starts with a gratitude for how far we've come, and just realizing what our ancestors kind of like put forth, and how much they paid forward for us to get to where we are. And then I think it also starts with looking at the future in a different light, and rather than kind of having this more default vision on the future of, what would a path be in which we all kind of like self-destruct, which, is certainly something that's kind of like a morbid fantasy that is just, I think, a bias that we have, that it's a little bit more interesting to think about. But rather than just like getting stuck in that, which is certainly easier, and somehow weirdly more attractive to our human minds, actually asking the other question of like, what would it mean to actively put something, uh, put like a foundation in place on which we could build wonderful worlds. And I think that from most stories, that that's a harder thing to do. Like, I think like, I think criticism is easier than putting something constructive in it, yeah, than making a constructive proposition. And B, I think like something negative also, it's the hero's journey. And so this kind of idea, mostly in like stories and narratives that we have in the media, um, of like, this kind of like moment of doom, moment of dread, that is definitely a good hook. It gets people agitated. We're definitely very drawn from that evolutionarily. We're like pretty wired to run on fear. So it's like attractive to human minds. And then there's, probably a bunch of other reasons too why we have this more, a little bit like like an outlook that is too negative if we just looked at where we are right now and the other worlds that are possible. So I think this whole outlook of looking elsewhere, is, I think, pretty attractive, and it fits well, I think, with what also DeSci is doing these days.
Of course. On a similar note, I'm wondering what your take is on optimism. I spoke with Jason Crawford not too long ago, who I know you know, and he has this really interesting distinction between descriptive and prescriptive optimism. Basically, the difference between, blindly accepting good things will happen versus deciding to work on ensuring good things do happen. Do you align with this at all? Do you consider yourself an optimist to begin with?
Yeah. Oh God, that's another, I think, question. And without wanting to get too boggled down in semantics here, like there's a lot of different takes on optimism. I think Steven Pinker is calling it intelligent optimism, on his website, of just like actually putting like actions in place that are um, that are tainted by the enlightenment, of like how we move forward. Then I think obviously Thiel has like a few different verbiages around this, that I think Vincent gave us a pointer on, of like really definite optimism versus indefinite pessimism, of which indefinite pessimism is really the worst, where like it's kind of like you don't even know why everything is going wrong, but it seems to be. But I also kind of like this idea, or at least like I want to put it up in the ring of vague hope. And so there is this concept, I think it was first put forward by Eliezer Yudkowsky, in the Sequences, which is like the rationalist Bible. And that's this idea that sometimes, if we are too specific and prescriptive around the specific futures we want to reach, if we don't reach them, we have this bubble bursting and people becoming extremely pessimistic about progress. And I think that this has happened to a variety of different technologies before, when we had the big winters and people really giving up because specific concrete prescriptions and goals and sometimes snake oil visions didn't come through. And so this idea that you want to kind of roughly paint a positive outlook that is broad enough to get a lot of people on board, um, but also not concrete enough that when we don't make it quite to specific milestones, that it causes like a huge kind of like failed expectation, setback, and pessimism wave again. So I'm kind of a fan of this. I think if you look at many of the predictions that people also in the foresight community have been making for a long, long time, um, a few of them have definitely come to fruition, and a few of them, we're not just quite there yet. A few of them also, the terms have changed. We now care about different technologies. And so I think, the more open you can be towards the future and the more open minded, while still being on a generally progress motivated path, I think the harder it is to get like buckled down in individual kind of like setbacks. And at the same time, I think predictions are wonderful because they allow people to put their money where their mouth is. But I'm just saying, in general, if you want to have like a hopeful attitude, I think it really helps to consider the entire pot of technological possibility. And certainly at Foresight, we have a very interdisciplinary approach. So I think it's sometimes informative for positive words.
Absolutely. You mentioned this, you sort of alluded to it in this idea of vague hope, but I'm curious to dig in a little bit further. Why do you think people are so pessimistic about the future? I mean, if you dig in, you'll find a pretty noticeable lack of positive visions of the future, especially in more recent years. Why do you think that is?
I think there's all kinds of questions, and I'm not like a psychologist who has studied this on numerous occasions, but I think, or at least I'm assuming that um, we've built up a ton of expectations um, over the years about where we should be. And actually, one of Foresight's previous presidents, Josh Strauss Hall, wrote the book "Hey Man, Where's My Flying Car?" and trying to just figure out why we were promised flying cars and why we're not there yet. And so I think we're now in this kind of like, if you look at this like a wave, or like a path to singularity as an S curve, I think we're definitely at this path where we were promised a lot, and like we see many of these things not coming through. It's not only that this is all kind of like a hallucination that we're not making progress. I think that as Tyler Cohen, Alex Tabarrok, Patrick Collison, many others have published really wonderful kind of like work, including Thiel, on like why we're stagnating right now, especially in science and technology. And I think that that's certainly room for improvement. But I think I'm still pretty optimistic about the future. I think generally speaking, there are two like different camps, I think, of people who are pessimistic about the long-term future. One of them are the ones I think that are just generally not convinced we are on a good path in general, like the ones that even doubt that until now we've been on a good path, on a progress-driven path. And I think those are perhaps a little bit easier to counter because we can just point to how we've made progress so far. But then the one where I think there's really a point to interact with are the ones which just point out, hey, look, maybe until now things have gotten better, but now we're at this kind of like point in human history, like maybe at the precipice, in the most important century, how Toby Ord and Will McGaskill pointed out, where it really matters, because now we have created the technologies that can either lead us towards really wonderful long-term futures or towards destruction. And I think that's just true. That is just true. And so I think if you want to interact with this claim, on an existential hope level, I think without wanting to be Pollyannish, you need to really accept that there are these really terrifying threats to the future of humanity. They are certainly there. I think one interesting approach that certainly people in Foresight take, and that has also been pointed out by Will McGaskill, and that I think there is a little bit more attention to now, is this approach of differential technology development, where we accept that technologies can really accelerate terrifying paths, but you also think that potentially, rather than trying to, through regulation alone, slow specific technologies down, which may not be possible on a global scale because there's always other nation states that would move ahead. Instead, it could be, or in addition to, it could be an additional approach to speed specific technologies up that are safety enhancing. And that's certainly one approach where I think I feel pretty at home, that many folks I think would undersign. If you would ask me to name an example, I think to make it just concrete, computer security is, I think, one specific example where that's probably net good if we get better security in place. And there are a few wonderful projects like SEL4, like basically a microkernel that comes from, I think, the University of Sydney, that where DARPA has tried to had one of their red teams try to break in and didn't find an approach of making any progress at like breaking the security system. And they, I think, really struggled with funding a few years ago, and that seems to me totally mysterious, why we're not just totally boggling down on the few technologies where we think like, okay, those are probably broadly positive futures enhancing, and there's a few probably where many people would agree on, and that's not the only one. There's a few others. Longevity, I think, is probably broadly good. There's a few kinks that we need to figure out, and social and inequalities aspects and so forth, but roughly that's a really, really good one to pursue. And there's more like this, but I think that this existential hope aspect for the long-term futures translates to me in terms of actionable items, often into differential technology development.
To put a bit of a bow on this subject, and in keeping in line with some of the things you spoke about earlier, I think it can be interesting sometimes to turn a question on their head. So to do that for a moment, in what areas do you think we're being too optimistic today?
Okay, there's two different types of optimism. Too optimistic in terms of we think progress is advancing faster than it is, or where fast progress is not necessarily positive for the long-term future.
Interesting. Take your pick.
Let's see. Well, okay, let me start with the first one. So I'm a big proponent of cryonics, while I care a lot about the longevity space, and I certainly do hope we'll make it through. I'm really not so sure, especially for people that are even our age right now, our chronological age, but certainly for our parents, I think they're not going to make it in time for LEV. And so I think if we want to give them a chance at living a wonderful long life with us, cryonics is definitely something we need to pay more attention to. And then secondly, I can just pick for the second one. Like within cryonics, I think also, we are not quite as far ahead as we should. And so I think it's really useful to drill down on progress in that area. It's uncomfortable for people to think about because it's already uncomfortable to think about the fact that death is bad. But then at least you can kind of hold yourself onto the next straw, that like you will, if you only lean into longevity, you'll make it through. And then also to realize that we may not even make it through with longevity, with current longevity and rejuvenation technologies. That's even more uncomfortable to accept. And so cryonics is an uncomfortable path to investigate, but I think it's just something we have to get around to doing. So that's one of them.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Foresight. As an organization, you sort of operate under these 5 technical programs of decentralized computing, molecular machines, biotech and health extension, neurotech, and Spacetech. I think I got all of them. How were these 5 identified as being the most important things to work on?
Yeah, so that comes a little bit, I think, from our past, that also obviously informed our mission statement and the other way around. So we, as a general heuristic, we try to support the scientific and technological development in areas that are to ambitious, and that could be interdisciplinary, early stage, what have you, for legacy funders to support in as much as we think that they are beneficial for a positive future. So we have like this specific, positive direction, and in that direction search for like undervalued opportunities. And then it has just been a historical, I think, coincidence that many people in our community have cared about these specific technologies a lot. And I do actually think that each of them has a point. So if we start, for example, with decentralized computing, that is a historical accident insofar as we overlap a lot with the early cypherpunks in our member constituents. And now many of these technologies are finally coming online, obviously with crypto and Web3 and DeSci. And I think a specific area that we focus on in that particular cluster are decentralized approaches to AI, and so trying to figure out what cryptography, security technologies have to say about AI futures on the long run. And so we focus a lot on specific privacy-preserving machine learning approaches, on specific approaches to getting security right, on specific approaches of really kind of like interweaving crypto and AI, which I think is something that is still being paid too little attention to. I come from the AI ethics field, and I think it's extremely difficult to align humans on values, and I have less hope that we can align one artificial general intelligence with human values, and I'm more optimistic that we can align multiple different actors in a decentralized way with specific sets of human values that can then hold each other in check. And so for me, this is also an AI safety angle. So that's one. Then for biotech in rejuvenation, like our history, again, is a big overlap with people that have been signed up to cryonics for a long, long time. They have cared a ton about longevity since our foundation, which was on the book Engines of Creation, a book on nanotechnology. And nanotechnology mostly really for cryonics and longevity and long-term spaceflight. And so it's been a historical accident. And at the same time, I also think that at least until 5 years ago, many people really didn't care about longevity yet. And so at our conferences 5 years ago, there were like, 30 people, most of them not funders. And that has certainly changed. And so to that extent, I'm super happy. That's why within longevity, I'm now pushing a bit more for cryonics, which I think is still an undervalued area within longevity. But I think, that one is a no-brainer to me, I think. And then molecular nanotechnology is kind of the founding technology, like the main technology that we're focused on very early on. And so that is basically asking the question of like, what could we build if we could build things with atomic precision by literally moving atoms and putting them in the places that we wanted them to be, rather than currently like wastefully on the very kind of like higher ends stacking things together. What if we could just actually build with like very low resource waste and incredibly cheaply from the bottom up with atomically precise manufacturing? And so that, has had like a very big summer early on Foresight's founding, and had a really deep winter for the last 20 years, and is finally coming back online, because now you see many of the design tools and design software tools in computer science, which is now having its big summer and spring, being extremely valuable for progress in molecular machines. And so we had this really wonderful workshop this year, design software for molecular machines, where we've had just like really great proposals coming out at the intersection of design tooling and molecular machines. So I think that field is totally coming back, but it's definitely still been pretty wintry in there until like even 3 years ago. And then neurotechnology is an interesting one because it ties in deeply with the longevity angle, and it also ties in deeply with the AI angle. So we are in next year, in 2023, and probably in Q1, we're launching a workshop with Andrew Sandberg together, who published the first roadmap for whole brain emulations, I think in 2007 or 8, if I'm not mistaken on the year. And in that he lays out the first roadmap to whole brain emulations. And really, no one has ever really come back and did a revamp. And now we're in 2022, and so we really thought it's about time people care about the metaverse again, but we don't really have very good input output into our cyberspace layers, and beyond that, we don't really have good ways in which we can richly cooperate with humans, and eventually, it could be a good longevity hedge as well. And so next year we're going to do another whole brain emulation roadmap workshop early next year, also with an AI safety hinge, because many people's AI timelines have been shortening very rapidly over the last, I would say, year, and then before that a few years, but the last year really rapidly. And if you think you have really short timelines, exotic approaches become more appealing. And so, at least from an AI safety perspective, it could also make sense to just look at specific whole brain emulation approaches again, insofar as we could really speed up human intelligence and potential integrations in that realm. Did I forget one? Oh, space. I forgot space. Space has been also a historical deep interest from ours. Many of our early conferences were together with the L5 community and extropianism. L5 community was the Lagrangian 5 community of like, how can you build kind of sustainable habitats or points for humans in L5 points around the Earth mostly, that could potentially be cheaper than like settling the moon or Mars or what have you.
Okay, I can't say I was expecting you to go so deep into all of this. That's super cool of you. Okay, so now onto tech trees for a moment. This is a concept you speak about quite a bit that I'd really love to dig into. The idea, as I understand it, is basically mapping out technological capability, these paths that got us to where we are today in a given field. How do you break the concept of tech trees down for people?
So let's see. There are a few great posts. I don't know if you usually do link drops or something, but I just want to point to
Yes,
a few
we
people.
can.
Okay. So Balaji posted on a tech tree that would basically allow individual investors to have an investment thesis that builds on the tech. Sorry, I should start from the beginning. Tech trees, as those of you who've played Civ may know, are really like a great way of slotting out the technological milestones that you need to get from where you are right now to the future where you want to be. And then a few people have riffed on this, Balaji being one of them, who basically said that a VC's portfolio thesis could potentially be revamped by something called a tech tree, that is basically a VC's kind of like, or an angel's a kind of like stack of the different types of technological capabilities that they think we need to hit to reach a positive future as they define it. So that's a little bit more like an individualistic approach, or like at least like an approach based for like that's relevant for one individual. And Trent McConaughey has published a really wonderful post on starships and tokens, which is basically drafting the alternative version to that, which is a tech tree that goes from the place where humans currently are all the way to Dyson spheres and reshaping the cosmos. And it's basically breaking down the different technological milestones that we need in AI, neurotechnology, decentralized computing, low cost energy, space flight, and so forth, breaking them down into individual buckets, and then with a kind of like with the idea that you could potentially put QR codes on that different people could fund with crypto, and others could, and those people wanting to work on solving these milestones could propose project proposals, and that then get funded if a certain threshold is reached, or specific people agree that those projects are great. So you could like crowdfund your way through this tech tree on a civilizational scale. And we thought, both ideas were great. And at the same time, we've been kind of thinking in parallel, how do we kind of communicate the work that our individual technical groups are doing to the outside? So the way that we push for our individual technological areas that I've described just earlier is that we have fellowships, prizes, and technical seminars in these specific areas. And we onboard, I don't know, about like a few people per month into these specific technology tracks. that are run through virtual seminars and in-person workshops. And oftentimes I get these emails of people that want to join these tracks, asking, what's the number one thing that they should be focusing on. And, I'm not the person to tell that to anyone. It's a ludicrous question for me to answer, but I wanted to make it a bit easier for people to find out. And so we thought, what if we kind of map the individual technology spaces that we try to push for in a way where new people coming to the field, and those could be new talent or new funders, would have an easier way of orienting themselves where they specifically could make the biggest impact. And so rather than doing Balaji's thing and of doing one individual investor, this is the tech tree that they have where they individually want to go. And rather than wanting to do the Trent McConaughey thing, which is as a civilization, where do we want to go? We did the middle thing of like, as a technological field, where should that be going? And so with the idea is that then people like Balaji can come in as an investor and pick and choose from different fields and build their own thesis, like their own path through the technology tree stack. And then, if you are interested in the more long-term civilizational tree, you could pull together the different technological tracks and their tech trees and ask how they integrate across each other to build a more long-term ambitious future. And so we try to do that middle ground just because that's the expertise that we have. Like we have domain experts in these fields. And so we set out to have like a team of tech tree leads in these areas that we just talked about, that basically interviewed our fellows and our mentors and our keynotes in these spaces, and to figure out exactly how do their individual subdomains in, let's say, neurotechnology unite to create a path for whole brain emulations. How do different people's work and longevity kind of like relate to build longevity escape velocity, and what does cryonics have to do with it? We ask people in molecular machines, how can we get from where we are right now to atomically precise manufacturing? Like, what are you working on? How does it relate to the work that other people are doing in that space, and so forth for the other technology stacks? And now we're at a point where we have like a beta version. We build a tool for it, and we haven't totally open sourced it yet because we're still wanting to build the first version pretty well, but we're hoping that at the end of this year we're at a point where the other people can at least tell us why we're wrong.
So this was implemented pretty recently. Maybe I'm reaching with the question, or maybe it's too early, but what would you say are some surprising bottlenecks that you found? Again, understanding this is a pretty recent implementation for you all, but I'd be curious to hear if anything unexpected maybe arose for you in identifying those technological bottlenecks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not one of the tech tree leads, unfortunately, so anything that I say is like from a very high perspective, and they will probably be upset with me because they probably have a much, much better answer to this question than I do. But I think a few fields that maybe not necessarily thought of themselves as being within a specific field, you could often cluster them in that field. And for them, it's then, a little bit more interesting to also look elsewhere of like, how does their specific innovation trickle through to other areas? And, I think a few of the work, really in like artificial organs and in that space, that is not always clustered within the longevity space, but certainly if you have a little bit more of an ambitious approach, I think, there's a lot of interesting work, I think, in that area that relates to long-term progress and longevity. And I thought it was really cool to see that just in relation to other work in that space. And, I think that ultimately the most interesting bits will really be at the intersection of individual trees. So, I'm hoping that once we have built them, we can take the, decentralized computing tree to a molecular machines conference that we do and show people what people in computing are working on and what tools they may have available very soon, so that folks in molecular machines, could have a little bit of an idea of like what other people are doing in a space quite outside of theirs, the tools that they could eventually take advantage of. And so there are certainly a few that I think are just, just shining up gradually on the event horizon.
Oh my gosh, you totally beat me to my next question. I mean, it's of course, it's definitely important to categorize technology to tackle it, but technology isn't necessarily as siloed as tech trees might make it seem. I think that was the first thing that came to mind for me when I was reading about them. So I guess that in mind, you're talking about modeling for like this interoperability between trees, that space where, biotech and molecular machines, or Spacetech and decentralized computing overlap. I guess a two-part question. First of all, how do you go about modeling for that and identifying these areas of overlap? And second of all, what do you see as being the unlocks as a result of doing that?
Yeah, well, again, we're still relatively early in this fund because we first want to get like at least the basics covered. Like it took a lot of time to set up the team, then to be kind of like figure out what even makes sense as a blueprint or as a skeleton for building these trees. They all look quite different. You can already look at a few of them, like prototypes on our website under tech trees, and they all look really different for each field, And first we thought, okay, should we like impose like a structure that each domain should follow? But then we thought it could be more interesting for the tech tree lead just to go out and see for their field what is the structure that makes most sense. And so now that we've done that, we're trying to just see how can we make them a little bit more congruent or like integrated across different domains. But yeah, so I'm assuming that like we haven't really done the integration across trees yet, because first we want to just be sure, like we basically have an extreme bottom-up approach, rather than trying to immediately tie the threads between different fields without really knowing, what we can deliver to that field. I think first we want to like get sure that like the, base bottom line information is correct. But at the same time, I think that there's a few like hunches. Obviously, like I think that, molecular machines, like my hope is that, as I said, like the computing space will have a lot to say about the molecular machine space in terms of better design tooling, but also in terms of potential, like better just, compute that folks could be using. And I think on the flip side, the molecular machine space, which also includes like, more like really hardware focused nanotech, could have a lot to say about a potential future compute design. And that's more on the very long run. But I'm seeing like a few interesting overlaps there already. Then I think the neurotechnology and BCI space will be pretty relevant for longevity eventually, like as we open up that bucket more, especially insofar as like neurotechnologies are really interesting for longevity. And I'm already seeing even on the tech tree. I wish I could screen share, but like even on the tech tree, like there are a few nodes that are pretty relevant already for longevity within neurotech. And then for molecular machines, I also think that they could be really influential for longevity. Obviously, like, I mean, we've all heard stories of like nanobots cleaning your bloodstreams, but I don't think we're actually that far away from that. We've had a few really great keynotes that, are just kind of otherworldly of like what you can already do with prototype nanobots. And, obviously, if we want to do anything in cryonics on the long run, we need a very advanced nanotechnology. So I think that, nanotech, the whole molecular machines tech tree, I see that as a very big enabling technology tree for the longevity tree. And so I'm really thinking that people working in the space of longevity could make really good use of looking at what's on the event horizon in molecular nanotechnology.
Awesome. So now on the topic of DeSci, which I know is an area of interest for us both, does this element of decentralization or DeSci more broadly enable tech trees or vice versa? Like, what would you say is the big unlock that decentralized science provides in the context of your work at Foresight?
Yeah, so I mean, on the tech tree end, there are certainly a few, and they are like, they started very unambitious to the very ambitious. So on an unambitious level, we've already asked, going back to the crowdfunding aspect, like we've already asked throughout. So basically, we've built these trees through domain expert interviews, and so we've asked all of these experts, like, what's the number one thing you would fund if only you had the money to, that is not your individual domain. And so we have this long list of challenges that they would like to do in an ideal world. And so we've started putting Gitcoin bounties on them. to outsource like, early stage proposal generation for how one could make progress on nodes. And so at the end of this year, we're going to basically have the tech trees integrated with specific challenge nodes that then link out to crowd-fundable challenges. And so, we're trying to really like on the one hand, open up the crowdsourcing of specific just questions of like, how would you make progress on this specific area? Like, write us a one pager about this. And then the idea is that over time, more people could fund these challenges, and we could really like, and people could also put money up for a challenge that we haven't really figured out yet. So let's say you're like a longevity philanthropist with a specific interest in an area, and you just want others to know that you would fund work in that area. You could basically like take it, take a challenge in that area and pin it on the tech tree and fund the best proposals that are being proposed to that space. So the moment we outsource the tech trees, it will also have this, ability for people to kind of like to cross fund specific domains by funding challenges. On the long run, sorry, I should also say that while currently the tech tree is still like, the moment we outsource them, the idea is that you can also fork your own tech tree from them. And so this decentralized notion of like, not everyone has to build on the same tree, but people can kind of like fork their own specific trees that are relevant for their areas will be a big part of this. And we will be allowing like crowdsourcing as well. So people really being able to make contributions on the tree and being rewarded for them. And so that's, all pretty, I think, DeSci compatible for me. Ideally, on the very long run, what we'd like to do is, to the notion of IP NFTs, right? For a second, like if you just think about a tech tree where you have a bunch of specific scientific challenges that are attached to a node, and you have crowdfunding, like you allow a bunch of people to put money in. If other people then propose a project to that, you could have this turn into an IP NFT where everyone who funded the specific node and funded a grant that then was given to the best project that was project proposal, that would actually turn into an IP NFT, and people could later on reap rewards for that. So I think that notion of IP NFTs, and this is not V1 of the tree, that is more V2 or V3, but you could really imagine like funding the way through an entire technology tree by having IP NFTs be unlocked at every specific node. And on another node, if you don't want to just fund research, but just wanted to fund startups, you could make the money that gets crowdfunded at an individual node just be an investment club. And so, you could KYC people that fund a node and just say, hey, this is a syndicate DAO now that is funding a specific node. And everyone who proposes a project that gets picked, the investment or the money that was locked in at the beginning just turns into investment into the company. For that, you obviously have to do KYC, but that's another option. And so, the long-term vision is certainly like an extremely decentralized kind of like, not leaderboard, but like, just tech stack that individual people can choose their battles on.
Amazing. You like keep just touching on the next question. It's fantastic. So, a bigger criticism of DeSci generally is this problem of effectively vetting for participation in a network, basically like ensuring individuals have enough relevant domain expertise, especially in science, to participate, but at scale, right? And in a decentralized manner. I think you'd have an interesting perspective coming from somewhere that, often deals with bringing together communities of smart people who work in the sciences. Is vetting people at scale a problem you've thought about tackling in a certain way?
I don't know. I mean, like vetting people, I'm not really sure what I think about that. I think that, on an individual level, you figure out really pretty quickly who makes valuable contributions and who doesn't. I think that, as long as you can really easily track who makes positive contributions, like the reason why I think, for example, reputation works well is because even in the pseudonymous systems, you can still have positive reputation. So, let's say that like one problem, of a pseudonymous system of like any kind could be that you can't really track people that like defraud. But I think as long as you can build a positive reputation over time, that is tied to your pseudonym, at least we can track positive contributions, right? Even if negative contributors could always defraud and sign up under a new pseudonym. And I think the same really holds also for DeSci. Like, I think as long as we can track really who makes continuously positive contributions to space, I think we should be fine. And the whole thing that I think DeSci really has to offer is like lowering the bounds of participation, right? So that like more people can make great contributions. If I found out one thing at Foresight is that people are incredibly versatile. Like people that are often our molecular machines track, they have amazing things to say. Sometimes in our longevity track as well, where I'm just like totally flabbergasted. And so I wouldn't want to exclude people by doing extreme vetting up front. I think as long as you can really track participation and then have good ways of removing kind of fraudsters from a network, or from a specific effort at least, I think that is like a specific feature that DeSci offers, which is like making it more accessible up front. So I think that I think it's more a feature than a bug that it has open participation, honestly. Even though I also do want to say that whenever we outsource our bounties on Gitcoin, it's not that, I think there's many fraudsters on it, but it's mostly that sometimes for, like, let's say we have a specific bounty for the neurotech tree of like, how can we build more durable, like prerequisites or like hardware for brain computer interfaces. It's just not the case that on Gitcoin you get the best answers. And that's mostly because not many scientists in neurotechnology are on Gitcoin yet. And so I think it's more of an onboarding problem of more people that are in science and tech with great domain expertise into the general DeSci space, rather than of like kind of, like, yeah, putting boundaries in place and vetting the people that are in it.
Totally. I think it'd be interesting now just to touch on some of the real world applications of all this. So you're a co-initiator of the Longevity Prize. Could you talk a little bit about how it came into being and what you think are maybe the key mechanisms to make progress in those areas?
Yeah, I'm a very big fan of, just I think, like specifically, like I think the people really at like Vita DAO and like many of the like, really early kind of like early DeSci DAOs and like and the broader molecule team too for kind of like living what they preach in terms of like really growing an ecosystem. So when like Vita DAO had had a grant out for a longevity prize in a previous Gitcoin round, they got funding, a ton of funding, and then they were really in like I think a hyper collaborative mindset and reached out to a few aligned organizations, of which we're one of them, to try to build a prize that would be a little bit different than like one large prize given to one big team at the end of a very long road, but rather do a little bit more something inclusive, which is build an ecosystem of different prizes that different people can contribute to, and that different people can kind of like get behind, and kind of like also create individual areas within prizes that they would like to fund. And so we launched it earlier this year, and so the prize is out right now. So if you are a potential funder in the longevity space and you don't really know what areas to fund, the longevity prize is a good place to donate to, just because we have a really wonderful committee of judges, and a wonderful set of potentially proposed prizes already, of which a few are out there already. And so prizes are a good way, I think, when you're not entirely sure which area to fund, to put your money to a prize, because that usually gets a ton of really great proposals going, especially if it's a prize that looks more like a larger bounty ecosystem where we divide it into a bunch of different prizes. And so yeah, really excited to like be part of this effort. And we have a few really interesting prizes out in the making. The first prize that is already out there is the hypothesis prize. So we give up to 20K for the best hypothesis that gets proposed to us through a one-pager of the number one project that we should solve in longevity. And so that's one way for us to kind of like source potential areas to give larger prizes to. And so yeah, I think so far I've been really positively surprised by the contributions we've already gotten, and by also, frankly, the participation on proposing new prizes. And so I think this more kind of decentralized approach to many smaller prizes that many people can win and create more of an ecosystem rather than like one large winner at the end of the day, I'm a big fan of, and it's working well so far.
Amazing. So to start wrapping us up, I'd love to hear, as someone who has like a top-down view on so many amazing things in technology, what excites you the most, firstly in DeSci, but also in the technologies Foresight covers more generally today?
Well, personally, I think I already spoke a bit about cryonics, and I spoke a little bit about decentralized computing. I think that this is really about an area that is like just weirdly undervalued still. It's a really difficult space, I think, to make sense of the intersection of crypto and AI. I mean, we all know, I think it was Thiel's statement, AI is totalitarian and crypto is libertarian. And so there's this maybe also inherent political divide between these areas of people interested in some of them. Um, or at least like, you know, there are at least some kind of like just really structural differences in the sense that crypto is very decentralized and AI often just happens to be through economies of scale and so forth to be a little bit more centralized. But I think that actually the intersection has so much to offer because we could really make, you know, compute like incredibly like a very democratized participatory approach to building the systems that we would like to have. Um, and I think that's really exciting. We wrote a book on this called Gaming the Future, which is basically an approach of figuring out why is cooperation so important. Um, how can we cooperate better across humans using crypto technologies? And how can we cooperate better across humans and AIs using crypto technologies? And so we kind of like made a few suggestions there of like specific areas that people can look into if they're interested in that intersection between, you know, humans, AIs, and crypto. And yeah, I think that's certainly one where I think that it just hasn't really not much thinking has gone through that, even though, you know, I think if you just take AI seriously and if you take the timeline seriously that many people in the field have, you know, we need to figure out safe, secure ways of making AI go well, and of having it be participatory. And I think that crypto has a lot to say here. And so I think it would be wonderful to get more people involved in that. I guess, you know, that's why we wrote the book. We're having a workshop on this at the early stages of October in San Francisco. But, you know, the whole point of the book and the workshop is to figure out which projects are already existing at that intersection and what, if anything, we can do to help them forward.
Amazing. Allison, we're, I think, just about at time now, but before we say our goodbyes, before we end, what would you say to people who want to get more involved in some of the work going on at Foresight? Where can they go?
Depends really which type of person you are. If you just want to follow along and like, you know, dip your toes, I would say, you know, you can follow me on Twitter at Allison Duettmann. My Twitter is basically a Foresight Twitter. Or you can follow Foresight Inst on Twitter. We also have another project called existentialhope.com. So the kind of positive future visions that I kind of like alluded to in the beginning, I note down all of my notes on positive futures, including all of the organizations to join, the kind of things I read and so forth on the page existentialhope.com. And then if you're interested in specific technology areas that I mentioned, we have these technology groups that are focused on one domain, and there's applications for each of them on our website. And finally, we have an upcoming member gathering, one in San Francisco at Chateau du Fay in France, and one in San Francisco at the Internet Archive and a private villa in Berkeley. And so if you want to meet people in person that are working on these technologies, then that would be a great one. Applications for subsidized free tickets are already available, which are closing soon. So if you want to meet people in person, that could be an interesting one to go to as well. And so yeah, there's different layers to join. If you are a potential donor and just want to kind of like support fellows, prizes, workshops, etc. in that space, then we do take donations. And there's many ways in which we collaborate rather closely with our donors, including a personal longevity group that focuses a bit more on like the personal longevity goals of our donors, private like donation retreats and so forth. But that's perhaps more like figured out by an email to me, which I think should be easily accessible, but it's at foresight.org as well.
Amazing. Allison, thank you so much for the time. This was amazing to get to do with you.
Thank you so much. I really am super supportive of this podcast. I think that you've had wonderful guests so far, and I'm really excited for where you guys are going. And it's definitely going to be a big source of information for me as this wonderful space of DeSci is growing.
That's great to hear. We're happy to do it. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like any information about this podcast or about Molecule, or if you're interested in going deeper into today's topics, feel free to visit Molecule's site, Twitter, or Discord. You can find all the important links in the description and show notes below. Also, if you're a researcher seeking funding, if you want to start working in a biotech DAO or get involved in any way, please visit the website molecule.to for more information. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you again soon.